Stop imagining problems you don't even have. Here's why. Alright, listen up. What if I told you that most of the problems stressing you out right now don't even exist? That's right. You're probably spending way too much time worrying about things that haven't happened, might never happen, and may not even matter if they do. But here's the kicker: your mind doesn't really care. It's wired to focus on potential threats, real or imagined, as if they're equally important. And that's where we mess up. The truth is, most of the problems we think about are purely creations of our imagination. We construct elaborate scenarios, potential outcomes, and worst-case possibilities that hijack our thoughts. And the irony: they're often fictional. Let me ask you this: how often do you find yourself worrying about something that, when you look back on it, never actually happened? Maybe you're anxious about a meeting next week, picturing all the ways it could go wrong. Or you're stressing about a conversation with a friend, imagining every possible negative reaction they might have. But how many of these scenarios actually unfold the way you expect them to? What we're doing is what psychologists call catastrophizing. We take a small concern, amplify it in our minds, and turn it into a full-blown disaster. It's like we're rehearsing for a tragedy that's never going to happen. And while we're busy playing out these imaginary problems, we're missing out on the present moment. We're putting ourselves through unnecessary suffering for something that exists only in our heads. Think about this for a second. What if you stopped imagining problems and focused only on what's real, right now? How much lighter would your life feel? How much mental space would you open up for things that actually matter? So why do we do this? Why do we obsess over hypothetical problems? The answer lies in the way our brains are wired. Evolution has shaped us to be hyper-aware of potential dangers. Thousands of years ago, this made sense. If you were living in the wild, constantly on the lookout for predators, thinking about worst-case scenarios could save your life. But fast forward to today, and those instincts are still with us, even though most of us aren't dealing with life or death situations on a daily basis.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Instead, we've turned that survival mechanism inward. We're scanning for threats in our relationships, in our work, in our future plans. And while it's helpful to be cautious and prepared, there's a huge difference between being aware of real challenges and inventing problems that don't exist. The Stoic philosopher Seneca put it perfectly when he said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." If you let that sink in, it's a game changer. So, what can we do about it? How do we stop imagining problems that aren't real? First, we need to challenge our thoughts. When you catch yourself spiraling into anxiety about something that hasn't happened yet, ask yourself, is this real? Is this a problem that's actually happening right now? Or is it something I'm imagining could happen? If it's the latter, recognize it for what it is: an illusion. Here's another trick: focus on what you can control. Most of the time, the problems we imagine are things we can't do anything about. We worry about how someone else will react or what might happen in the future, but those are things that are fundamentally out of our hands. You can't control how other people think or act. You can't control the future. So why waste your mental energy worrying about it? Focus on what you can do right now in this moment. The rest will take care of itself. Let me hit you with something deep. What if the problems you're imagining are actually holding you back from solving the real ones? Think about it. When your mind is occupied with made-up problems, you're not dealing with the real challenges in front of you. You're not focusing on what's actually happening in your life, and as a result, you're missing opportunities to grow, learn, and move forward. Now, I'm not saying you should be naive or ignore potential risks, but there's a big difference between being prepared and living in fear of things that might never happen. Preparation is practical. It's about taking action on things you can control. Imagining problems, on the other hand, is about letting your mind run wild with anxiety over things you have no power over. It's wasted energy. Here's a question for you: how much of your life are you missing out on because you're too busy imagining problems that don't exist? How many opportunities for joy, connection, and peace are you passing up because your mind is trapped in a loop of hypothetical disasters? You see, when you stop imagining problems, you free yourself to live more fully. You become more present. You focus on what's in front of you, rather than what's lurking in the shadows of your mind. And this shift in perspective can change everything: your relationships, your work, your sense of self. In fact, when you let go of imagined problems, you start to see life for what it really is: unpredictable, yes, but also full of possibility. Every moment that you spend worrying about something that hasn't happened is a moment you could be using to create, to connect, to live. So, the next time your mind starts conjuring up a problem that doesn't exist, catch yourself. Ask, is this real? And if it's not, let it go. Focus on what's real, what's present, and what you can control. You'll be amazed at how much lighter life feels when you stop carrying the weight of problems that aren't even there. How imaginary problems hijack your happiness and steal your focus. Let's get real for a second. How much of your day is spent thinking about things that haven't even happened yet? Be honest. We've all been there, caught in this endless loop of what-if scenarios, where our minds race ahead, imagining every possible disaster or inconvenience. And here's the crazy part: while we're busy worrying about things that might go wrong, we're missing out on what's right in front of us. We're letting imaginary problems steal our focus, hijack our happiness, and sabotage our sense of peace. But why does this happen? Why do we let these imaginary problems take over our thoughts and emotions? The answer is surprisingly simple. Our brains are wired to focus on threats. From an evolutionary perspective, this made sense. Our ancestors needed to anticipate danger to survive. But the problem is, our minds haven't evolved much since then. We're still hyper-focused on potential threats, even when they're not real. Think about it. When was the last time you found yourself completely absorbed in something positive, maybe a beautiful sunset, a moment of laughter, or a deep conversation, only to have your mind suddenly wander off to some potential problem or future worry? It's like your brain is programmed to scan for threats, even in moments where there's no immediate danger. And here's what's wild: most of the time, the problems your mind is conjuring up don't even exist. They're just shadows, illusions. Now, let's pause for a second. What would your life look like if you stopped giving those imaginary problems so much attention? If you could redirect all that mental energy toward the present moment, toward things that actually matter? The truth is, most of us have trained ourselves to constantly anticipate problems, to the point where we're living in a state of low-level anxiety at all times. And this constant state of worry not only steals our happiness, but also destroys our ability to focus on what's important. But here's why this is such a big deal. When your mind is preoccupied with imaginary problems, you're not fully present in your own life. You're distracted. You're putting up mental barriers between yourself and the things that bring you joy, peace, and fulfillment. You might be sitting with friends, but instead of enjoying their company, you're worrying about whether you'll meet a deadline at work next week. You might be taking a walk in nature, but instead of appreciating the beauty around you, you're stressing about a conversation you imagine will go wrong tomorrow. And the worst part, none of these problems are real. They're just mental projections of things that might happen, but probably won't. It's like you're carrying around a backpack full of rocks, but the rocks aren't even real. They're imaginary weights, dragging you down, making everything in life feel heavier and harder than it needs to be. So, let me ask you, why are you carrying those rocks? What would happen if you let them go? Here's the thing: imaginary problems rob you of your focus, and without focus, you can't fully engage with the present moment. And if you're not engaged with the present, you're not really living. You're just existing, going through the motions while your mind is somewhere else, worrying about things that haven't happened and may never happen. This is why it's so crucial to catch yourself when you start spiraling into these imaginary scenarios. You need to bring yourself back to reality, back to what's actually happening, not what might happen. When you allow yourself to be fully present, something incredible happens. You reclaim your happiness. You stop letting future worries dictate your current state of mind. You become more focused, more productive, more engaged with the people and experiences around you. And most importantly, you stop wasting energy on problems that don't exist. So, the next time you catch yourself imagining a problem that isn't real, ask yourself, is this helping me? Is this bringing me any closer to what I want in life? If the answer is no, and it almost always is, then it's time to let that thought go. Focus on what's real, on what's happening right now, and leave the imaginary problems where they belong in your imagination. Breaking the cycle: how to stop feeding your imaginary fears. Let's face it, imaginary problems don't just appear out of nowhere. We feed them. We give them energy, attention, and time, turning tiny seeds of doubt into full-blown fears. It's almost like we're addicted to imagining the worst-case scenario, as if worrying about it somehow protects us from it. But here's the truth: it doesn't. All it does is keep you trapped in a cycle of anxiety, robbing you of joy, focus, and peace. So, how do we break this cycle? How do we stop feeding these imaginary fears and start living more fully in the present? It all starts with awareness. Most of the time, we don't even realize we're spiraling into anxious thoughts until we're already deep in them. But if you can train yourself to become more aware of your mental patterns, you can catch those thoughts before they take over. Ask yourself, when was the last time you caught yourself worrying about something that wasn't even real? Maybe you were worried about a conversation that hadn't happened yet, or a problem that hadn't even materialized. The first step is recognizing these patterns. Once you see them for what they are, unfounded, imaginary fears, you can begin to untangle yourself from them. Here's a practical way to do this: label your thoughts. When you catch yourself imagining a problem, mentally say to yourself, "This is an imaginary problem." Just by naming it, you take away some of its power. You're reminding yourself that this isn't something that exists in the real world, it's something your mind is creating. This simple act of labeling can stop the spiral before it starts. Another powerful tool is asking better questions. Instead of letting your mind run wild with what-if scenarios, flip the script. When you feel yourself starting to imagine a problem, ask, what's the evidence that this will actually happen? Most of the time, you'll realize there's little to no evidence at all. You're just projecting your fears onto the future, assuming the worst when there's no reason to. But let's take it a step further. Even if the thing you're worrying about does happen, so what? What's the worst that could happen? This is where Stoicism comes in with a brilliant mindset shift. The Stoics practice something called negative visualization, where they would intentionally imagine the worst-case scenario, not to feed their fears, but to make peace with them. By confronting the worst possibility head-on, they stripped it of its power. They would think, okay, if the worst happens, can I survive it? How would I handle it? And in most cases, the answer is yes. You'd find a way to deal with it, just as you've dealt with countless challenges before. Here's a deep question for you. How many times in your life Have you faced something you thought was the worst-case scenario only to realize it wasn't as bad as you imagined? More often than not, reality is far kinder than our minds make it out to be. When you face challenges in the real world, you adapt, you grow, and you move forward. But when you battle imaginary problems, you're fighting ghosts that don't exist, and you can never win that fight. So instead of feeding your fears, start feeding your reality. Focus on what's actually happening in your life right now. What can you do in this moment to improve your situation, no matter how small the action? When you shift your attention from imaginary problems to real, actionable steps, you begin to take back control of your mind. You stop being a victim of your thoughts and start becoming the architect of your life. It's also important to practice letting go of perfectionism. A lot of our imaginary problems come from this unrealistic belief that we need to get everything right all the time. We imagine problems because we're afraid of making mistakes. But here's the reality: life is messy, unpredictable, and full of imperfections, and that's okay. The sooner you accept that things won't always go according to plan, the sooner you'll stop imagining problems where there are none. So, the next time you find yourself feeding an imaginary fear, stop and ask, is this real? Is this helpful? What can I do right now to focus on what's actually important? Breaking the cycle starts with small, mindful steps. Over time, you'll find that you're spending less energy worrying about things that don't exist and more energy living in the moment where life is actually happening. Living in the real world doesn't mean pretending that problems don't exist. It means recognizing the difference between real challenges and imagined ones. It means focusing on what you can control, taking action where necessary, and letting go of the rest. It's about understanding that life is messy, uncertain, and unpredictable, but that's okay. You don't need to create extra problems on top of that. So here's my final challenge to you: stop imagining problems you don't even have. Focus on what's real. Focus on what you can do right now. Because when you live in the present, free from the weight of imaginary fears, you'll discover a kind of freedom and peace that you never thought possible. And that, my friend, is where true happiness lies. Here's the real kicker: when you let go of imaginary problems, you gain clarity. You stop wasting your energy on things that are outside of your control or things that haven't even happened. You start to see opportunities where before you saw obstacles. You realize that most of the things you feared were simply shadows in your mind, and when you shine the light of reality on them, they disappear. Let me ask you this: how much of your life are you missing because you're stuck in your head? How many moments of happiness, of peace, of connection are slipping away because you're too busy worrying about a future that hasn't arrived yet? The truth is, the present moment is all we ever have. And when you're fully in it, when you're not distracted by imaginary problems, you're able to experience life fully, whether that means savoring a simple meal, having a meaningful conversation, or just enjoying the silence. Living in the real world, how letting go of imaginary problems sets you free. You've come this far, and here's where everything clicks. What happens when you stop imagining problems? What happens when you finally let go of those mental constructs that have been weighing you down? The answer is simple: you become free. Free to live, free to experience, and free to focus on what's real. When you stop feeding those imaginary fears, something profound happens. You start to see the world as it truly is, not as a projection of your worries. You become more present. You begin to engage with life, not as a series of what-ifs, but as a series of what is, and that's where the magic happens. You're no longer stuck in your head, battling against hypothetical problems that don't exist. Instead, you're grounded in reality, where you can actually do something, where you can take meaningful action,